All right, everybody, welcome back to another week of Ghost in the Scene. I'm your host, Gio. I'm back with my co-host, Rob Thomas, and we are welcomed with a very special guest, Chaz of the Dead. He is a recent author of a great book, Paranormal Expeditions, Hunt for the Friendship, a story of UFOs, Nazis, psychedelics, and an expedition to the edge of the world. Chaz, how are you?
I'm great. I'm great, guys. Thanks for having me on.
Being an author is something that I've always wanted to do. How is it writing your is this your first book?
Yeah, it is. And it was kind of a weird process. I kind of first released this first volume of research as a podcast initially. And it was like a 5-episode one-off little docu-series. And it was mostly, I wrote the scripts while I was traveling, on location. So it was kind of an unfinished product. And after it finished, I had all this leftover material that didn't make it, and all the initial material, and I decided to put that together. And by the end of it, I had twice as much content as the podcast had, and I decided to put it out and share it with the research community.
Wow, that's incredible. That's really inspiring, honestly.
Are you self-published or did you find someone to help you get this material out there?
I self-published. I shopped around to some, smaller, independent kind of horror publishers, and no one really wanted to bite on a non-fiction paranormal. There wasn't really that appetite there, and there were a few offers, but not really much benefit coming my way. And I had built my own kind of little following, so I decided to release it to them, to my fans, and release it myself. And it actually got picked up on a couple shows and podcasts, and started hitting this kind of little cult popularity. So I'm glad to be contributing.
Yeah, and honestly, it's great to be in the realm of the nonfiction paranormal. And I think that's something that people might scoff at, but in reality, that's kind of how the true believers see it. It's not fictionist, and it's not some kind of spooky tale. Although you can be scared by ghosts, that's not necessarily the object of what ghosts are trying to do.
Right. And it is hard with that label nonfiction, because it is these stories that are reportedly true. And of course, everyone's heard a story. Even the most diehard believers have heard a story and been like, I don't know about that one. It happens. But that's part of the fun in the genre, is that each piece of evidence, each story is almost a thought experiment in itself. And it's something you get to spend time with and ponder. So I include the stories about this case in particular, pretty true to how they were reported. I put my opinions, at the ends of each chapter, kind of in a summary. And I'm harsher on some areas and nicer to some areas. I have my own biases as a researcher. But I think it's an intriguing argument I try to make.
Honestly, that's the hardest part about being in the paranormal community, is having to sift through, you know, what's phony, what's not phony, what's believable, what's not. And, coming to that your own conclusion is a difficult one, because then, you find yourself in a certain lane, and other people kind of have more extreme ideas, other people have more limited ideas. And it's kind of hard to be like, okay, well, I'm in the paranormal community, but I don't go, we have a moon base, or a hollow earth, or the flat earth. There's just certain things that where we kind of intersect with other communities, but we're not really a part of them.
Right. Yeah, there's a lot of division and that kind of stuff. And when I started out, many years ago, when I was a teenager, kind of just toying with these ideas, I was much more in that kind of realm where, I thought ghosts are this thing, and then maybe UFOs are real, and then who knows what Bigfoot is. And as I kind of got more into the research and conducting my own experiments, kind of moved on to focus on what facilitates these sightings, because it seems to be a similar thread throughout all of these encounters, and it seems to be related to our consciousness in a degree. And that's kind of the angle I'm looking at. It borders on psychology. Definitely still pseudoscience, what a scientist would call pseudoscience, but it's trying to take it from, you know, EVPs in a dark, empty hotel into something that's more of a reputable experiment, something you can repeat over time and get similar results.
That's great. Yeah, that's kind of what we like to do here too. You know, we like to present, you know, evidence, facts, just things we see as unbiased as we can. It's really hard to not put your spin on it, you know. But at the end of the day, you know, you're just trying to get the truth out. You're just trying to get like what you believe is the closest thing to the truth. And many people might not like it, or many people might not get it. And it's, you know, it's not for everybody. But the paranormal is just kind of something, like you said, when you're a teenager, you got into it. I'm guessing this has been a lifelong passion for you.
Yeah, it started when I was much, you know, probably 8 or 9. I had a strange experience. I was sharing a room with my older brother. We had just installed bunk beds, and I promise this is all relevant. And he was sleeping on this bottom bed, and we built this bunk bed on top of it. So he got moved to this top bed, and I got moved to this bottom bed. And a few weeks into this, you know, sleeping arrangement, I fell out of bed, and middle of the night, I see this pair of red eyes staring at me from underneath the bed. And it's almost like a, you know, thinking back on the memory, it's almost like a Halloween cartoonish graphic. Like it's just a cheesy kind of pair of red eyes you'd see in a movie. And being a kid, I jumped back in bed and put the blanket over my head and, you know, waited till sunrise. And when the sun did rise, I got out of bed and I started digging for anything under the bed that could have made, you know, an electric light. You know, and I was a young kid. There was a bunch of junk under there, and I'm cleaning and I'm looking for things. And my older brother, he's coming down the ladder of the bunk bed, and he sees me doing this. And without me saying anything or explaining what I'm doing, he asks, "Did you see those red eyes too?" And it's because he had that experience, you know, a month before, sleeping in that same bed. And for me, that was kind of like an aha moment. Like, well, I like even the most rational explanation is that we just had a shared dream. But that in itself is some kind of telepathy, which is paranormal. It was evidence that there's definitely something weird going on.
Something,
And
yeah, with that haunted bunk bed.
you know, it was a weird one-off because nothing ever really happened again like that in that room or related to that. You know, I've never considered my childhood home haunted or anything. It was really just that one weird experience.
You know what's interesting about ghosts is, you know, and also just with people that see ghosts, is that usually it is only one time, because after that it's like you turn on the awareness and it's like you're always looking, and it's like they have that thing where it's like if you're looking they won't come, you know. It's so it's that weird filter where like as soon as you become aware of ghosts and then, you know, now have seen one, it's harder to see them afterwards. And then it becomes an actual like job. Then you work to actually communicate with ghosts. It no longer becomes this like simple trick that you can do, you know, as a child at least.
And
Yeah,
maybe
definitely.
before you answer, Chaz, sorry, I might want to like maybe push on what Gio's saying as well and say, like, have you developed any ways since that time to be more effective at communicating with ghosts that isn't so passive? You know, obviously as investigators, we want to try to be as active as possible. If there's any techniques that you've developed since that time.
True.
So actually what kind of started me down the road to what eventually led to the book was an attempt to do that. And it started with these experiments that I had an idea that the phenomenon was related to our consciousness. So my plan was to take mushroom teas, hallucinogenic teas, and play the
Okay.
Ouija board. Because everyone says Ouija board, no, definitely bad.
Yeah.
You'll definitely see something, speak to something. And I conducted these experiments. I took vigorous notes, EVP sessions throughout. Um, nothing, nothing,
Nothing.
um, nothing really occurred, except in between the experiments. Well, so the first thing I saw, the first paranormal thing that occurred was I was just prepared one of these teas. I was setting up for one of these experiments, and I just began drinking it. And
And for
mushrooms.
clarification, are you doing this on your own, or are you doing with others? Are you relying on your own energy? Are you trying to like set the energies within anything else?
So we were solo experiments. But
Mm.
before each psychedelic experiment, I do a pretty traditional Buddhist meditation,
Mm.
kind of a mix of different. Yeah, yeah, one might call it chaos magic. I do a centering ritual and definitely get in the right headspace for 30 minutes to an hour before conducting one of these psychedelic experiments. And that's
Smart.
something I do, before each one. Other psychedelic experimenters, psychonauts, think maybe that's a little silly, but I definitely respect those things. Don't necessarily believe in it. The Ouija board's a good example. I've had mine for many years and used it many times and haven't really had any ill will come towards me. Um,
Yeah, they always say that, and it's I honestly don't know, where these anecdotes are coming from that their Ouija board has attacked them, but I haven't met a single paranormal investigator that doesn't use the Ouija board as like a tool. Most people say that they collect them that we've talked to. So it's an interesting thing. It seems like the non-paranormal community kind of shits on Ouija boards and uses it as a scapegoat. But reality, it's a tool that's kind of hard to use. I mean, just because it really doesn't work like 60% of the time. If
I would say even higher
Yeah,
than
maybe higher. Yeah.
that. Yeah. Yeah, it's definitely maligned. And interestingly enough, it's the same. I do think it could have those negative effects if maybe you saw a Ouija board movie once as a kid and you grew up in a super Catholic family and then you play with the Ouija board. That might cause a weird, what science would call schizophrenia, but what the church would call a possession.
Mm.
And I do think there's a very blurred line between those two things. But a person who is raised in that Catholic background, I think the best thing for it is an exorcism. It's the same mechanism that allows it to happen. This almost what a lot of people would call an irrational belief is what caused it. The same mechanism through exorcism can release it. So that's a whole. It's a weird concept, but I think for the most part, if you're not sure that you're gonna get possessed, then you probably won't get possessed. If you're like pretty sure it's gonna happen, then there's a pretty good odds that it'll happen.
Well, it's that energy, it's like you're inviting like a vulnerability and you're sending that out. This like I'm vulnerable. And like, the idea of spirits, energy, it's synonymous to some. I would say in my personal opinion, I mean, what is a soul but just energy, just boundless energy, right? So I don't know, just the idea that some like dead people, that their souls, their energy, wherever that goes, it can get attracted if you are vulnerable, if you're open. And a possession, could be a lot of things. It could be over time, just like a change in personality, or it could be, you know, drastic, like you were saying, you know.
Mhm.
And I've
And there's
heard.
also
Oh, go ahead.
the concept of walk-ins, where it's not quite a, you know, a demonic possessing entity like you see in the movies, but it's like, you know, someone down the road died, and for whatever reason there's extra space in your brain, and they just hop on in. I believe it was Billy Milligan, who had 23 distinct personalities, and they all kind of just they asked him, and they all just said they kind of hung out in his head, and one would stand in this kind of center spotlight, and then they get to control the body. And they would speak in different dialects. Some of them knew different languages, and it's these really bizarre things that are definitely unexplainable. But we kind of just wrap up as, oh, you know, he just made that all up. And maybe, you know, that's one
Maybe.
of those things where, you know, we can guess on forever, and we definitely a few hundred years from knowing that answer.
Right, if at all.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, but it is coming from somewhere, even if he's, you know, quote unquote making it up. It's um you know, it takes quite the imagination, and then there's like we were this whole conversation is talking about these sort of subconscious levels that we may be tapping into. And so I'm curious, you know, you were talking about bringing it back to the experiments, you know, trial and error, obviously the scientific method. You said you were taking some of these teas, Ouija board not working out so much. What was the turning point where you started to see some success in your experiments?
Right. So we started going down that route. So I had prepared one of these. I was getting ready for one of these experiments when the initial strange thing happened. I had just started sipping this tea, and you know, typically mushrooms take maybe 45 minutes to an hour to kick in. This had been only maybe 5 minutes, 10 minutes of sipping. When I see I'm sitting in my backyard and I'm watching planes cross the sky and leave, you know, trails in the sun setting. And I see this one object. At first, I think is a plane, but it's getting brighter and brighter, and there's no blinking. And suddenly, it bursts into several smaller objects, and they just scatter off. It almost looks like you know, like a spaceship re-entering and exploding. It was very bizarre. And being in Florida, we have that kind of, you know, satellite reentries and things. So I did the research, and I tried to find any information, any reports, any, you know, news coverage, any scientific documents covering it. Nothing. It seemed to be this one-off thing that only was fairly localized to my area, and I thought that was pretty bizarre. I kind of, you know, just wrote it off though. I wasn't, again, I was doing Ouija board experiments. I was looking for something, you know, demonic, more or less, you know, some kind of ghost activity, poltergeist activity. I wanted my chairs to start stacking themselves, you know. That's what I was looking for.
Right.
And that was the first kind of strange thing I saw while doing these experiments. A couple weeks later, this would be about in between two experiments. In the middle of the week, I was conducting these weekend experiments. In the middle of the week, I was explaining this first encounter to a friend of mine. And we were sitting roughly in the same area where I saw that first UFO. And he kind of says, all right, yeah, you know, mushroom teas, you saw a UFO. Cool. Great story. Whatever, you know,
Right.
kind of shrugging
Skeptic.
it off. And I was like, okay, yeah, I understand. Clearly a reasonable response. And we start to hear a low hum, this kind of mechanical hum. And past the tree line, there's kind of a light. One of us jokingly says, you know, oh, maybe that's the UFOs, you know, like they're here to visit us. And almost ironically, this large triangle shaped craft, there was a light in each corner. It just kind of slowly hovered over the house. You could hear the hum the whole time. And it was low. It was lower than any plane or helicopter. I could have thrown a rock from the street, dinged the side of it. It was, you know, very low down, just above the tree line. And it kind of just hovered there for a minute and just buzzed on by. It kept going at this pretty slow pace, but consistent. And here in where I am in Florida, this is part of the Gulf Breeze Flap, which in the 90s, a slew of these exact same triangle craft were seen up and down the state on the Gulf of Mexico side. So it was kind of this weird, again, this second confirmation. And there was nothing ghostly or paranormal besides those two events related to those experiments. And I conducted 6 or 7 of those experiments, and those were the two, events that occurred. And that kind of really pushed me past thinking that these were really separate phenomenon to more of the idea that something else is occurring. I can't ignore the fact that I had this intention. I was like, okay, I'm gonna take these substances and I'm gonna see something paranormal. And I was thinking ghost and poltergeist, anything like that. And the phenomenon said, okay, you want to see something weird? I'll show you something weird. And
Right.
it took the left turn. So I've kind of been rolling with it. I've kind of been experimenting with different variety of cases. And the friendship case was a kind of the first really big UFO. And it's hard to call it really a UFO case because the UFOs are strenuously connected. But the first kind of high strangeness case that I really took on. And it's definitely been it's been bizarre.
Right. I mean, once you hop into the paranormal world, it just gets weirder and weirder and just more synchronous, like the more people you meet and the more connected everybody is. And you take a step back and you realize that, we live in a very small world in a very large universe. It's like things are just unexplained, and it's hard to, sit with that a lot of the time, but it's kind of interesting and nice to sit with some things that are unexplained, and the phenomenon that people tell you and all the things that, I've, countless ghost stories that you hear and you don't know if you believe it, but that when they say it, they believe it, and you kind of back to your idea of like perception that, like you can get into a state where it is the truth, where you do believe because it happened to you. And, I've had a UFO sighting as well. And I mean, as real as day, I mean, it was very interesting. My whole family saw it, and it wasn't like, it's not a secret in our family, but it's just kind of like a known, like we don't even talk about it anymore. But other
Yeah.
people, they spend their whole lives like chasing UFOs. And I don't know, your idea of maybe having a little bit of that mushroom tea and then
Mhm.
throwing out that intention, that energy. I think that's one thing, when you use a Ouija board, you're like trying to connect, right? It's like that ET phone home kind of thing. You're sending out a signal, and maybe some kind of telepathic signal that an alien can read, a readable signal,
Mhm.
some kind, and then maybe in that way, the paranormal and the alien are connected just in the fact that, that energy is somehow tappable via spirit or via alien.
Right. So I kind of take it even to an extension past aliens when it comes to a variety of the phenomenon, and this comes from the idea of biocentrism, and this has been an idea in philosophy for a long time, in Gnostic philosophy, but Robert Lanza, who I believe is a neurosurgeon, Dr. Lanza, he wrote biocentrism, which is kind of a modern scientific take on this idea that reality is almost entirely sensory, right? It takes place up in here. Without our nerves, there's no touch, sight, smell, and he extends the senses to include space and time. And that's where it verges on things that Einstein was theorizing about. It gets into quantum mechanics, things that I'm definitely not qualified to explain. So if you do want to know more in the specifics of the science, please check out that research. But if we take this idea that time and space are also part of our limited sensory perceptions, and that they can be altered just as much as any of these other perceptions, then the idea of, you know, ghosts and entities from the past and the future, or from different realities or different planets, all of this becomes, you know, not just possible, but pretty common, because all realities of all these sentient beings are clashing and combining. We only agree on this kind of common reality, and if you've noticed, it's still pretty hard to agree on that. Most people still don't agree on what the common reality is. So it's all very, very subjective to each individual. And I think that's part of the phenomenon and how it facilitates itself. And as an investigator, though, I have to admit the most intriguing cases are when it breaks that barrier, where it's not the individual, it's a whole group, a whole schoolyard, you know, an entire office building sees a flying Mothman. You know, it's those kind of cases where it's extra intriguing. So that's why I now try to conduct my experiments with, you know, with people around, you know, witnesses, because you know, conducting these psychedelic experiments, I kind of discredit my own eyewitness testimony, right? It's hard to take it at face value. But if I can see something weird and my companion can also see something bizarre, and then we have, you know, another super sober person sees something weird, then we can kind of get this kind of repeated phenomenon in a group setting. That's what we're really looking for, to push it past the individual. If we can move it past that stage, because you know, if you just want to take psychedelics forever, you can start seeing, you know, ghosts and monsters, and how real those are going to be only subjective to your individual experience. And if other people aren't experiencing it, that's how you end up in a loony bin.
Right.
So it's definitely an interesting conundrum. It's hard to experiment with something, experiment with consciousness objectively, because you are a conscious being observing it. So it's impossible to do it unbiased. You just try to mitigate it as much as you can.
Now, I mean, here's a question, because I know that there are listeners, you know, want me to ask this. What about ghosts as helpers? The idea that, you know, let's say our perception, of course, is going to be skewed. But what if we have like a double blind, you get ghosts to do the experiment for you, and then you ask the ghost what they got, and, you know, that way you're out of the equation. But you'd have to have a way to connect with a ghost and be friendly with a ghost for them to do it for you.
Yeah, to develop those kind of consistent relationships. I suppose it's possible. You know, I've tried doing some summoning experiments. I've gotten some bizarre results, some borderline violent poltergeist results on one attempt.
Interesting.
But from the most part, and from the research I've done, most entities seem unable to maintain long-term contact, or unwilling, and emphasis on that latter. I
Yeah, I
think a
think
lot of
so.
the times, you know, these entities who are making contact are doing it for mischievous reasons. You know, if they are existing in this, you know, ethereal realm, higher or lower or different than us, then the only, it's kind of like the only, it's kind of like vice versa in this situation. The only people bothering to interfere with the other realm are kind of weirdos, right? You know, the ghost hunters, and
Mm-hmm.
you know, those kind of people. They're just poking and prodding. And I think if it is a higher realm, there's probably not too much respect coming down towards the human realm. So I think there's a lot of times you see entities leading people on wild goose chases. you know, promising things like, oh no, the world's definitely going to end. Tell everyone, all pastor, tell all your church that the world's going to end on this date, and get everyone to believe it. It's true. And, you know, we see those ramifications all the time. I do think that person's experiencing something real. But, you know, it's just real to them. And whatever the entities are getting out of it, it doesn't necessarily seem to be beneficial to humans a lot of the times. So using them on a consistent, you know, paranormal basis, treating them like entities and using them on a more consistent paranormal basis is pretty difficult in the experimental terms. I definitely interested in what's more kind of like the time loop kind of hauntings, where a good example is here in my city at the Ringling Museum in Sarasota. It's the circus, Ringling Circus. John Ringling built this big Venetian palace on the bay, and it's said to be haunted by his ghost. And it's this pretty consistent footmarks just appearing on the cold tile, you know, when you have a warm foot stepping on tile like that. And it kind of just seems like it's just, for whatever reason, him walking through the halls, you know, kind of over and over again. And it doesn't seem to be too much. They're not really open for night investigations, but there doesn't seem to be too much, you know, communication going on. It just seems to be more of this weird kind of replaying of a past event. And those are things, if we could, you know, kind of capture on a repeated basis, that I think would make really intriguing evidence that would be hard to ignore.
Right. Just get some like a guy who does wet cement, and he does the floor.
That's a good idea.
1 week you take a photo, and then you just do it again the next week. You pave it over and just see if the footprint's still there.
Yeah, I actually, that's weird you said that. I just read the other day about a medium, and I believe it was 1920, and that was how they tested her. Is they had doctors and professors, they held her to the chair, they held her hands and arms, and she commanded the spirits to push the spirits' hands into wet cement, and they had the impressions, and they couldn't explain it.
Wow.
Even Houdini, I believe, was asked to explain it, and he just never responded. So it was one of those bizarre ones. Yeah, it was an interesting mediumship case. Not that I'm
I believe that's
Mina
Mina Crandon that you're speaking of, I believe, right?
Yeah, I think that is the name. I'd have to double check, but yes, the weird clay polymer stuff that they use to test her. Pretty intriguing stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think it also goes to show that this is, you know, we're on a lineage. You know, I think whenever we are doing these tests, that we are standing on the shoulders of those who came before us, and especially in terms of time, it makes me wonder, you know, about the timeline also of ghosts reaching out to us, because obviously this is not a one-way communication, and how it's becoming more and more mainstream that people are realizing that any sort of phenomena or UFO, you know, we're so stuck in our human flesh, our human bodies, our human perceptions. We're saying like, oh, aliens need to be from carbon based, but there's no real reason. We don't have actual evidence to say it should be like us. And the more we learn that it's more unlike us. So I don't know if that's something for us to be hopeful about, or is it something to be like, oh, are we ever going to find out because it's just so beyond us?
I think it has I think we have a ways to go, especially when we hear the idea of, you know, people talk about the singularity and how it's right around the corner when it comes to machine learning, or which I think might be the bigger one, faster than light travel. And that especially comes into play when it comes to these, you know, UFOs, the craft that people are seeing. But with both of those, it comes down to a basic misunderstanding of consciousness and of individual reality. You know, you can keep crossing wires forever, but you're not going to be able to put the ghost in the machine. You know, it's not, it's it's the issue that we haven't resolved. It's the thing we haven't really acknowledged, that there's something non-physical to our consciousness. And when it comes to the faster than light travel, it was back to Einstein who theorized that the closer you get to faster than light travel, that's when objects shrink and time starts to move differently. And this has been confirmed. It was theory when he talked about it, but it's been confirmed. One little element, though, that's not really acknowledged is he said this happens for the observer, for the person on board or close observing that craft. And I pretty much through my research, I posit that what would it look like to watch a ship travel through space and time as a human being with our limited sense of perception, with our 6 colors? What does that look like? And I theorize that it looks like a psychedelic drug trip. And I think that's why people who have been abducted, who have ridden on these craft, they come back with these unearthly stories that sound ridiculous and insane. It's because they are. It's because that's just how they perceive them. There's so much, mind-bending things happening that it's just the mind trying to process it, and it comes off in that psychedelic way.
Wow. Well, so we're running out of time. We have so much more to talk about, but it's great to talk to you. Where can our audience find you?
I'm available at chazofthedead.com, Chaz of the Dead on Instagram and Twitter. And of course, check out my book, Paranormal Expeditions, Hunt for the Friendship. It's available on Amazon.
It's great talking to you, Chaz. We will have you back to talk about more of your investigations out in Florida. Hopefully we get the Ringling case locked down. This sounds interesting. Thanks, man.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, guys.